Thank you, Senator Billick. Senator Reynolds.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy President. Well, today I think will be remembered as a day of shame for those opposite. And I'd like to start off by noting that the larger the fraud and the more audacious the fraud, the harder those who perpetrate it will fall. And eventually those opposite, and particularly Minister Shorten, and those who went through the charade and supported the charade of the inquiry into this bill, the ultimate Royal Commission that I think one day will eventually come about because of the way this government has perpetuated this fraud. And as we heard from Senator Steele-John so passionately and so eloquently today, something that is causing immense pain and suffering and anxiety to over 650,000 of Australia's most vulnerable Australians with disability, and the many hundreds of thousands of their loved ones, their parents, their siblings and everybody else who cares about them. And the shame of it is it never had to be this way. It didn't have to be this way. So it's very important, I think, to go back to find out how we got to the position we are in today. So let's forget the monumental effort of spin by those opposite and the spinmeister himself, Bill Shorten, who has spent 3 years spinning the politics of this to his own advantage, instead of actually spending 3 years working with those across this chamber and in the other place to redesign this scheme, to fix the obvious flaws that were emerging 4 to 5 years ago now and that we kept calling out. As Minister, I was very proud, despite the utter criticism and the invective that I got from Bill Shorten, day after day, week after week, saying that how stupid I was, that I obviously couldn't read the books, that there was no problem here. But clearly there have been problems that have been baked into this scheme from the legislation when it was introduced in 2013. Now, that wouldn't have been so much of a problem had we not, as these problems started to emerge in the scheme, as it started to grow, and not only having growing pains, but with the realisation and the clear realisation that the legislation and the intergovernmental agreements as a federated scheme had baked within this scheme. As the scheme grew and as the budget started to blow out well beyond what the Productivity Commission and governments of the day had imagined it would be, we went to those opposite and said, and the sector, and said, we need to deal with these structural flaws. We need, like any other demand-driven scheme, like MBS, PBS, just because they're demand-driven doesn't mean they don't have controls of them. Of course they do. Of course they have controls in terms of the two drivers of cost, the amount of people who have access to the scheme and the average cost and what they can actually get from the scheme. But neither of those drivers is manageable by the minister and by the federal government who is responsible for delivering this scheme. So it was very clear what was required. And what did Bill Shorten do as the then opposition spokesperson? He ridiculed. He said there is no problem. He cruelly promised everybody on the NDIS and their families, don't worry, we will have no cuts. We won't cut any of your plans. So, don't vote for that mob. We will look after you. He perpetuated the fraud and the fiction that this was a scheme that did not need reform, and how wrong he was. And he must have known that, because budget after budget, quarterly report after quarterly report, showed that this was a scheme that was spiralling out of control. And in fact, today, it is the third largest Commonwealth expenditure item, and it's on track to become the second, and if not managed and fixed, it will be the most expensive. So by 2032, over $100 billion annually. Now, that is clearly not sustainable, and the scheme will fail if we don't come together to fix it. So let's have a look at the genesis of this legislation. And I don't think I could said it any better. What Minister Shorten has managed to do is completely unite the disability sector, the families and participants, against them. Because they are not stupid, Minister Shorten. They understand the fraud you have perpetuated on them, and they are worried. So 12 of the largest disability representative organisations have said this about the bill. The recommendations in this report of the Senate Community Affairs Legislation Committee into the NDIS are profoundly disappointing and disrespectful. Our organisations are deeply disappointed that the Senate Committee, not even the government, the Senate Committee of this place, did not listen to the evidence and the expertise of people with disability, our families, our supporters and our organisations who made extensive and detailed submissions about the flaws in this proposed legislation. I participated in this inquiry, and the government gave less than a month and 2 days of hearings and 1 hour with the NDIA, if my memory is correct, to do justice to all of these submissions. And we said, give us another month so we can have more hearings into this legislation, so we can hear the voices of the community, so we can work with you, government, to make this dog of a legislation that will make the situation worse, so we can improve it. Marching instructions from Minister Shorten, no extension to the inquiry, was a complete disgrace. So this is what the sector has also said. We have engaged with the committee over 3 hearings and provided substantial evidence and lived experience. And anybody who sat through and listened to this evidence could not have failed to be moved. And it is beyond comprehension how those opposite who sat in and heard and read this evidence still forced this committee report through and are now supporting the introduction of this legislation. It is unfathomable. And this is what they also said. People with disability feel a loss of trust in the parliamentary process that promised to listen to us as we contemplate significant reform to the services and supports provided through this scheme. And that process shames each and every one of us in this Senate chamber. And I hope when this report comes to this chamber, not only do we throw out this bad legislation, but we throw out that report, which was a complete abomination and an insult to every single person in this chamber. So, after saying that there was no problem with this scheme, what did Minister Shorten do? He came into government. We'd already had 30 reviews into various aspects of the NDIS. We knew the problems. We knew the problems 3 years ago, 4 years ago. We knew where the solutions lay. Tough discussions 3 years ago with the states and territories. Changing the legislation so that the scheme could be managed and managed effectively. But no, they didn't have the guts to go through that process. Instead, the minister got his mates and did another review, an 18-month review. Yep, some reasonable things in the review, but none of them were new. And they went out and, the government has been trumpeting how many people they've been engaging with and listening to. So that report, we reported in December, 26 recommendations, 139-odd specific recommendations to implement. Some of them I agree with, some of them I don't. But there was a lot of reasonable suggestions in there and a number of things that actually did tackle the structural problems with the intergovernmental agreements and also the legislation. But guess what? December that report was provided and a draft before that to the government. We still do not have a Shorten government, an Albanese government report. But yet, no government report on their position on this report. But what we do have is we have legislation which is purported to implement the review. But guess what? It doesn't. It does not implement anything of substance in the review. There are 3 parts, maybe 3.5 if you're generous, of the 26 major recommendations that are even touched in this legislation. But you know what it does do? It claims that it's going to be entirely responsible for the $60 billion of cuts that this government has made to the scheme over the next 10 years. $15.5 billion over the next, between $14.5 and $15 billion over the next 4 years alone, over the forward estimates. But the government has not been able to say where and how this legislation is going to realise those savings. They haven't released any of the modelling, any of the assumptions that underpin that modelling, not one. And again, we go into finance estimates, we go into Treasury estimates, we go into community affairs estimates, with DSS, with the NDIA, and all of them say, oh, well, yes, we've got these numbers from the poor NDIA actuary. And I said to him, I feel you're the most unluckiest man in this country, because everybody is looking to his planning and assumptions, his heroic assumptions that underpin the $60 billion worth of savings, which is what this bill is actually all about, and they don't have the courage to release them. And I suspect they don't because it completely reverse engineers. What's been pretty clear is the government has said we're going to make these cuts. They cobbled together this legislation that actually has almost nothing to do with the review, which I suspect is why we haven't seen the government response to the review. But they've made $60 billion worth of cuts on the assumption they can get what they said was a 14% year-on-year increase. In fact, under the last 12 months under Bill Shorten, year to year, the third quarter results, which is the last one we've got, under Bill Shorten there is a 21% increase. So they are making $60 billion worth of cuts. They say under the sustainability framework, which is more elusive than the Scarlet Pimpernel, no matter where we look, no matter how we try, we cannot find anything to tell us what the sustainability framework is and the assumptions and the modelling that underpins it. So not only are they going to drop the current rate from 21% year-on-year increase down to 14%, they're going to get it down to 8%. And the only way they've got an agreement with that tentatively from states and territories is they've said, well, the current 4% cap will take it up to 8%, so you'll have to pay year-on-year increase of 8% after the next 2 years, and then we'll pay the rest. But what they haven't made clear is they've also promised the states and territories that there'll be a no worse off clause. So how is that going to work? How is that going to work? Who's going to pay for the extra increase? Well, clearly the Commonwealth taxpayers increase. So part of the big fraud that lies behind this is that this legislation is designed in the most chaotic way that will cause, and that is already causing, great angst and concern amongst our most vulnerable in our community. But the savings that they're going to have to get and the supplementation from the budget they're going to have to keep getting is well beyond the $60 billion they've already ripped out of the scheme. So can I just say in conclusion, if Bill Shorten had actually spent less time and less money on spin, and I'd like to remind those in this place that the government, Bill Shorten, through the NDIA or the review, I'm not quite sure, has spent $400,000 on research and communications, 4 reports this thick, to tell them how to spin the legislation. And guess what? So it's all about to sustain a values-based conversation about fixing fraud in order to stop the exploitation of Australians. So don't talk about the cuts, is his communications advice. So guess what? Bill Shorten, in his speeches, which no doubt have been written by his new speechwriter who's getting paid over $600,000 for 2 years of work, despite having 400 communications staff across his agencies and departments, we're chasing down the rorts while we're building a better NDIS. Have a look at Minister Shorten's speeches in the parliament, his second reading speech. Everything he has said publicly is all written straight from this Redbridge Communications. It is all about the spin and not about the policy, and shame on you.
Senator